You will marry her, Vincent, and you will end 100 years of blood between our houses, and you will do it whether you can stomach the sight of her or not." So his father had said, 3 weeks dead now, and the Duke of Castleforth stood at the chapel rail on his wedding morning and found that he could not, in fact, stomach the sight of her, for the simple reason that he had not yet brought himself to look. She was a thorn. Her people had feuded with his people for a century, a quarrel over a strip of river meadow grown, through generations, into something poisonous and absolute. Raids and ruined harvests and cold cuts at every gathering, 2 great houses teaching their children to hate before they could spell. And now, to settle it, to bind the meadow and the bloodline and the long grievance into one piece, neither family had been able to make any other way. He was to wed Agnes Thorne, the daughter of his enemies, a woman he had been raised since the cradle to despise. He looked at her at last, because the vicar required it. He had expected, he hardly knew what, a cold, hard, scheming face, the face of the enemy. What he found when he turned was a young woman standing very straight beside him in a gown the color of winter, her chin level, her eyes fixed ahead, her hands clasped before her, not in maidenly nerves, but in the white-knuckled grip of someone holding herself rigidly, fiercely still. She did not look like an enemy. She looked like a woman walking into a fire with her head up, determined that no one should see it burn her. She looked, he thought with an unwelcome jolt, exactly the way he himself felt. "I am told," she said quietly for his ears alone, as the vicar drew breath, "that you have been raised to hate me. I have been raised to hate you. Let us at least be honest with one another from the first hour, Your Grace, since we are to be honest about nothing else." Her voice did not shake. "I do not want this any more than you do, but I will not shame my house by weeping at the rail. Say your part, and I shall say mine, and we shall make of it what we can." The Duke of Castleforth, who had braced himself for an enemy, was thrown entirely off his footing by the discovery of an ally. For that was what she sounded like, not a scheming thorn triumphing in a match that joined her house to his, but a fellow prisoner of the same old quarrel, dragged to the same altar by the same dead hands, and meeting it with the same grim courage he had meant to bring himself. "Say your part," she said again, very low. "They are all watching to see which of us breaks first." So he said his part, and she said hers. And they were married, the Thorne and the Castleforth, before the 2 stiff and silent families ranged on either side of the Isle, like opposing armies under a truce no one trusted, and the river meadow and the 100 years' grievance were bound into one piece, and the Duke of Castleforth walked out of the chapel with his enemy's daughter on his arm and discovered that he had no idea at all who she was. He set out, in the cold weeks that followed, to find out. He had meant to keep his distance. A marriage of state required no warmth. He would be civil, he would be correct, he would keep to his wing of the great house and she to hers, and they would meet at dinner and present a united front to the world and feel, privately, exactly as they had always felt. That was the plan. The plan did not survive a fortnight. For Agnes Thorne, Agnes Castleforth now, a name that still sounded strange in both their mouths, was not what a century of feud had taught him to expect. She did not gloat or scheme, or carry the old quarrel under his roof. She was, he found, quick and dry and unexpectedly funny. She ran the tangled household with a competence that put his late mothers to shame, and she met his guarded coldness not with coldness of her own, but with a steady, level honesty that he found, against all his intentions, disarming. "You are waiting for me to be wicked," she observed one evening, over a dinner they took together at a table built for 30, the 2 of them marooned at one end of it. "I can see you watching for it. You expect a thorn to poison the soup or sow discord with the servants or writes spiteful letters to my father about your failings. I am sorry to disappoint you. I find I am too busy keeping this enormous house from falling down about our ears to spare any time for villainy. My father," the Duke admitted, "described your father to me a great many times, and never once kindly. And my father described you to me, Agnes said, as the cub of a brute. I confess I came here braced to find one. She studied him across the candlelight. I have not found one. I have found a grave, tired man who is trying very hard to dislike me because he was told to, and who is not, I think, naturally a hater at all. The hate was lent to us, Vincent. Neither of us minted it. I begin to wonder why we are at such pains to keep paying it back. He had no answer for that. He turned the new wedding band upon his finger, a habit he had already acquired, this turning of the unfamiliar ring, and found that he could summon, when he reached for it, none of the old inherited loathing. There was nothing there to loathe. There was only a clever, honest, courageous woman who had been handed the same poisoned inheritance he had, and who was plainly and sensibly declining to drink it. The thaw came on slowly, the way a hard winter breaks, a day at a time, almost without notice. They began to take their dinners deliberately rather than by chance. He showed her the disputed river meadow, the strip of grass over which 100 years of blood had been spilled, and they stood looking at in the cold sunlight, this small ordinary field, and helplessly, to laugh at the smallness of it, at the madness of two great houses tearing themselves of generations over a meadow a man could walk across in 2 minutes, and her laughter was so warm at the Duke of Castleforth, who had not laughed in a long while, found himself laughing with her, the two of them standing of all their misery and finding it at last absurd. 100 years, he said, wiping his eyes, for this. For this, she agreed. I think our grandfathers must have been very bored men to make so much of so little. And something gave way in him standing there, some last cold wall he had been holding up out of duty to the dead. He looked at his enemy's daughter laughing in the disputed meadow, the wind in her hair, the whole stupid weight of the old quarrel made suddenly weightless by the sound of it, and he understood that he had stopped, some while ago and without marking the hour, thinking of her as the enemy at all. She was simply Agnes. She was the best thing the feud had ever, in its long bitter history, produced, and it had produced her by accident, in the very act of trying to bury itself. I was told to hate you, he said, and his voice was not quite steady. I came to this marriage certain I would. I want you to know, I think you ought to know, that I have failed at it entirely. I cannot hate you, Agnes. I have tried out of loyalty to a quarrel I did not start and have come to find ridiculous, and I cannot manage it. What I feel is the precise opposite, and it has crept up on me so quietly that I did not see it coming until just now, watching you laugh in the field our families have hated each other over for 100 years. Agnes Castleforth went still. The laughter faded from her face, but what replaced it was not coldness. It was something far more careful, far more hopeful, a thing she had plainly not let herself feel until he said it first. I came braced for a brute, she said softly. I told you so. I did not tell you the rest. The rest is that I stopped being braced some weeks ago, and have been, ever since, quietly terrified, not of you, but of how little I wished to keep my distance from you. I thought it weakness. I thought it disloyalty to my house. She took a breath. I think now it may be the only sense either of us has shown. The feud wanted us to be enemies. It seems we have disappointed it. Thoroughly, the Duke said. Let us go on disappointing it. And he reached out, there in the meadow that had cost their families a century of grief, and he took her hand, clasped it, warm and sure, the first time either of them had touched the other from wanting and not from duty, and she did not pull away. She turned her hand in his and held it back. The peace their fathers had forced upon two houses became, in the months that followed, a thing far warmer and far truer than any treaty, a real marriage, made not of grievance buried, but of grievance healed. The two families, watching, hardly knew what to make of it. They had braced for a cold dynastic arrangement and a chilly civility maintained for the meadow's sake. They found instead a duke and his duchess who were plainly, unmistakably in love, who finished one another's sentences at dinner, who walked the disputed field together of an evening and laughed at it, who had taken 100 years of hatred and quietly, stubbornly, refused to inherit a single year of it. And the feud, which generations had been unable to end with raids or lawyers or grim arranged truces, was ended at last by the only thing that had ever been strong enough to end it. Two people who had been ordered to hate each other and had fallen in love instead. On the anniversary of their wedding, the Duke of Castleforth walked out with his wife to the strip of river meadow, as had become their custom, and they stood in the long gold evening light where the two estates met, and were no longer divided. 100 years of blood, he said, and it took only the two of us, and one foolish field, and a single year of refusing to keep the quarrel. Not the field, Agnes said, leaning into him, his arm coming warm about her shoulders, and not the refusing in the end. It took you, Vincent, a man I was promised to hate, who turned out to be the home I did not know I was looking for. She looked up at him in the gold light. Our fathers thought they were ending a war. They did far better than that, and never knew it. They gave me you. He held her there in the meadow that was no longer disputed, in the peace that was no longer forced, and he thought that of all the things the long, bitter quarrel of their houses had ever produced, the only one worth keeping was the woman in his arms, and that he would keep her and love her all the rest of his days, in a house where, for the first time in a century, there was no enemy left at all.